A soft morning light filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 302 in downtown Atlanta's Municipal Court. Judge Michael Bennett adjusted his black robe as he settled into his high-backed leather chair, the familiar creak of wood beneath him a reminder of another Monday morning about to unfold. At 45 years old, Judge Bennett carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent the last 8 years ruling from this very bench. His salt-and-pepper hair and clean-shaven face gave him a distinguished appearance, though the slight shadows under his eyes hinted at the long hours he'd been putting in lately. "Good morning, everyone," he announced to the packed courtroom, his voice carrying that practiced blend of authority and detachment. The mumbling crowd of traffic violators, minor offenders, and their lawyers quickly fell silent. The morning sunlight caught the golden state seal mounted on the wall behind him, casting a warm glow across the room. Sarah Martinez, his court clerk for the past 5 years, handed him the day's docket. 37 cases today, Your Honor," she whispered, placing a fresh cup of black coffee, his third of the morning, beside the stack of papers. Judge Bennett nodded, already scanning the first page of violations: speeding tickets, running red lights, illegal parking, the usual Monday morning parade of minor infractions. The courtroom itself was a perfect reflection of Bennett's personality: orderly, traditional, and meticulously maintained. The dark wood panels gleamed from recent polishing, and even the American flag in the corner looked freshly pressed. He ran his courtroom like a well-oiled machine, earning both respect and fear from the local legal community. Officer James Patterson, a regular face in Bennett's courtroom, stood near the bailiff's desk, reviewing his notes for the day's cases. He caught the judge's eye and gave a respectful nod. Bennett returned the gesture, remembering how last week he'd upheld every single one of Patterson's traffic violations. The officer had a reputation for being thorough with his paperwork, something Bennett deeply appreciated. As the bailiff called the court to order, Bennett took a moment to straighten his nameplate: Honorable Michael J. Bennett, ensuring it faced the perfect angle toward the gallery. It was these small details, he believed, that set the tone for justice. His reputation for being strict but fair hadn't come by accident. It was built on countless small decisions and an unwavering commitment to the law. Looking out at the crowd, Bennett noticed the usual mix of faces: nervous first-time offenders in their Sunday best, repeat visitors who knew the drill, and lawyers in varying degrees of expensive suits. What none of them knew was how Bennett had spent his weekend, poring over legal journals and reviewing recent appellate court decisions. He prided himself on staying current with the law, just as he had during his days at Emory Law School. The first case was about to begin when Bennett felt a strange sensation, almost like a premonition. Something about today felt different, though he couldn't put his finger on what. In his 8 years on the bench, he learned to trust these instincts that served him well before. "First case," Sarah announced, her voice clear and professional. The familiar routine began, but Bennett couldn't shake the feeling that today wouldn't be just another Monday in courtroom 302. The morning light continued to strengthen, illuminating the dust particles floating in the air like tiny stars. Bennett took another sip of his coffee, its bitterness grounding him in the present moment. He had earned this position through hard work and dedication, climbing from a middle-class background in suburban Atlanta to his current role dispensing justice in one of the city's busiest courts. His colleagues often joked that he could process a traffic violation in his sleep, and some days it felt that way. Each case followed a familiar pattern: hear the violation, review the evidence, listen to the defense, make a ruling. Bennett had it down to a science, averaging just 12 minutes per case. Efficiency and fairness, these were the pillars of his courtroom. As the first defendant approached the podium, Bennett straightened his posture and cleared his throat. Whatever this day might bring, he would face it as he faced every day, with unwavering dedication to the law and the firm belief that justice should be blind to everything except the facts before him. Little did Judge Michael Bennett know that this ordinary Monday would soon become one of the most extraordinary days of his career, challenging everything he thought he knew about justice, bias, and the power of unexpected reunions. Dr. Regina Washington stood in front of her bathroom mirror, carefully pinning her silver streak locks away from her face. At 63, she carried herself with the same grace and determination that had helped her become one of Emory Law School's most respected professors over the past 3 decades. The speeding ticket lay on her dresser, its bright yellow color seeming to mock her from across the room. 2 weeks ago, on her way to deliver a guest lecture at Clark Atlanta University, Officer Robert Mills had pulled her over in what she knew was a notorious speed trap on Ponce de Leon Avenue. 72 in a 55, he had claimed, though Regina's cruise control had been set precisely at the speed limit. She had noticed how his body camera was mysteriously turned off during their interaction, and how his hand had rested unnecessarily on his holster throughout their exchange. As she slipped into her charcoal gray suit, the same one she wore for important court arguments, Regina thought about the 3 other black professors who had been pulled over in that exact same spot over the past month. None of their tickets had stuck in court, but that wasn't the point. The pattern was too clear to ignore. Her colleague, Dr. James Thompson, had urged her to just pay the fine. "Regina, it's not worth the hassle," he had said during their lunch break. "These things have a way of getting messy." But Regina Washington hadn't spent 30 years teaching constitutional law to back down from injustice, no matter how small it might seem. She gathered her materials, a folder containing photographs of the speed trap location, data on traffic stops in the area showing racial disparities, and her spotless driving record spanning 4 decades. Her hand smoothed over the papers, each document representing hours of meticulous preparation. The morning traffic crawled along Peachtree Street as Regina made her way downtown. Her silver Toyota Avalon, the supposed vehicle of her offense, moved steadily through the Atlanta heat. The car's radio played softly. Nina Simone's "I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free," a fitting soundtrack for the morning ahead. As she pulled into the courthouse parking lot, Regina noticed Officer Mills entering the building. He walked with the confident stride of someone who assumed his word would never be questioned. She watched him for a moment, remembering how different his tone had been when he first approached her car, before seeing her university ID card and professional attire. The courthouse security guard, an older black man named Walter, greeted her with a knowing smile. "Fighting a ticket today, Dr. Washington?" he asked, running her bag through the scanner. She had represented his grandson pro bono last year in a similar situation. "Someone has to, Mr. Johnson," she replied, her voice carrying the warm authority that had guided countless law students through complex constitutional arguments. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor gave Regina time to center herself. She had stood before the Supreme Court of Georgia, argued cases that had changed state law and shaped the minds of future legal giants. A simple traffic court appearance shouldn't make her nervous, yet her heart beat a little faster as the doors opened. Courtroom 302 was already filling up when she entered. Regina chose a seat in the middle row, her posture perfect, her expression serene. Around her, other traffic violators fidgeted and whispered, many looking worried about missing work or school. She noticed she was one of only 3 black people in the room who weren't wearing security or maintenance uniforms. Officer Mills sat near the front, shuffling through his papers. He glanced back once, his eyes widening slightly when he recognized her. Regina met his gaze steadily, her expression unchanged. In her briefcase was a file containing his department records. 3 previous complaints of racial profiling, all mysteriously dismissed. The clock on the wall ticked toward 9:00 a.m. Regina reviewed her notes one final time, though she knew every detail by heart. This wasn't just about a $300 speeding ticket anymore. It was about patterns, prejudices, and the quiet ways injustice crept into everyday life. A young law student intern entered the courtroom, carrying a stack of files. He stopped short when he saw Regina, clearly recognizing her from her faculty headshot at Emory. She gave him a small nod, remembering how many times she had told her students that the most important cases often started with the smallest injustices. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "All rise." As everyone stood, Regina took a deep breath. 30 years of teaching law had taught her that justice sometimes needed a reminder of its obligations. Today, she was prepared to deliver that reminder, not knowing that the biggest surprise of the morning was yet to come. The morning proceeded slowly in courtroom 302, with Judge Bennett moving through cases at his usual efficient pace. When the bailiff finally called Regina Washington versus State of Georgia, Officer Mills straightened his uniform and Regina gathered her materials with steady hands. As she approached the podium, Regina noticed how Judge Bennett barely glanced up from his papers. His fingers drummed impatiently on the bench as Officer Mills presented his case first, a routine recitation of speed, time, and location. "Your Honor, The officer spoke with practiced confidence. On April 15th, at approximately 2:45 p.m., I observed Dr. Washington's vehicle traveling at 72 miles per hour in a 55 zone. He paused, then added, "The radar gun was recently calibrated, and weather conditions were clear." Judge Bennett nodded, accepting the officer's statement without question. When he finally looked at Regina, his expression carried that slightly bored, slightly irritated look of someone who had heard every possible excuse for speeding. "Dr. Washington, do you have anything to add?" His tone suggested he hoped she didn't. Regina opened her folder with deliberate calm. "Yes, Your Honor. I have several points I'd like to present regarding this citation." She began pulling out her carefully prepared documents, but Bennett raised his hand to stop her. "Dr. Washington, this is traffic court. We don't need a full presentation. Did you or did you not exceed the speed limit?" His words cut through the air, sharp and dismissive. The professor and Regina wanted to point out the logical fallacy in his question, how it presumed guilt and ignored context. Instead, she tried again. "Your Honor, I believe it's important to consider the broader context of this citation. I have evidence suggesting—" "Dr. Washington," Bennett interrupted, his patience clearly wearing thin, "this court has 23 more cases to hear today. Unless you have direct evidence disputing the radar reading, I suggest we move forward." The courtroom had grown unusually quiet. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations had ceased. Regina stood straight, her dignity intact despite the judge's dismissive tone. "I do have evidence, Your Honor," she persisted, her voice clear and steady. "First, there are documented issues with traffic stops at this specific location." She tried to hand forward a statistical analysis, but Bennett waved it away. "That's not relevant to your specific violation, Dr. Washington." Regina felt a familiar frustration rising in her chest, the same one she'd experienced countless times throughout her career when facing systemic barriers. But decades of teaching had taught her to channel that frustration into precise, measured responses. "Your Honor, if you would allow me to present my full defense." "Dr. Washington," Bennett cut in again, his voice carrying a note of finality, "this court appreciates thoroughness. We're not here to discuss broader social issues. This is a simple matter of whether you were speeding on the day in question." Officer Mills stood slightly straighter, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Regina noticed how comfortable he looked, how certain of the outcome. She had seen that same confidence in countless other situations where authority went unquestioned. "Your Honor," Regina tried one final time, "my cruise control was set exactly at the speed limit. I have documentation showing." Then its gavel came down with a sharp crack. "That's enough, Dr. Washington. This court has heard sufficient testimony." He began writing on his citation pad, barely looking up as he spoke. The young law student intern in the back of the courtroom was frantically taking notes, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. He had just covered procedural due process in Regina's class the previous week. Regina stood perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the podium. She had expected resistance, but the complete dismissal of her evidence was surprising even to her experienced eyes. The air in the courtroom felt heavy, charged with unspoken tensions. Judge Bennett finished writing and looked up, his expression suggesting this was just another routine matter in his busy day. Given the clear evidence presented by Officer Mills and the lack of compelling contrary evidence, this court finds. It was at this moment that Regina decided to reveal her full identity and credentials. She hadn't wanted to rely on her position, had hoped the strength of her evidence would be enough. But as she opened her mouth to speak, she knew this case was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would shake the foundations of Judge Bennett's carefully ordered world. Just as Judge Bennett was about to pronounce the fine, Dr. Washington straightened her shoulders and spoke in the same clear, commanding voice that had captivated law students for 3 decades. "Your Honor, before you issue your ruling, I believe it's important to properly identify myself for the record." She paused, her eyes meeting Bennett's directly. "I am Dr. Regina Washington, tenured professor of constitutional law at Emory University School of Law, where I've taught for the past 30 years. The change in Judge Bennett's expression was subtle but unmistakable. His pen stopped mid-sentence, hovering above the citation pad. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by a wave of color draining from his cheeks. I also serve as the director of the Civil Rights Legal Clinic, she continued, her voice steady and measured. And more relevantly to this court, I taught advanced constitutional law to the 2009 graduating class, where I believe you, Judge Bennett, earned one of the highest grades in my seminar on equal protection under the law. The courtroom fell into complete silence. Even the usual shuffling of papers ceased. Officer Mills looked between the judge and Dr. Washington, his previous smugness replaced by uncertainty. Bennett sat frozen in his chair, memories flooding back with unstoppable force. He remembered sitting in the front row of her classroom, furiously taking notes as she passionately explained the importance of procedural fairness. He remembered her strict but encouraging feedback on his papers, her unwavering dedication to justice, and most importantly, her constant reminder that true justice required hearing all sides of a story. Dr. Washington, he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Professor Washington. The formal title felt strange in his mouth, considering how many times he had addressed her as professor or ma'am during his law school days. Sarah Martinez, the court clerk, noticed how Judge Bennett's hands trembled slightly as he set down his pen. In 8 years, she had never seen him lose his composure. Dr. Washington remained standing, calm and dignified, as though this was just another teachable moment in her classroom. Yes, Your Honor. I believe you wrote your final paper on the importance of procedural due process in minor violations and its impact on community trust in the legal system. It was quite impressive. The irony of the situation hung heavy in the air. Several attorneys in the gallery exchanged knowing looks, while the law student intern in the back was typing frantically on his phone, presumably sharing this incredible moment with his classmates. Judge Bennett looked down at the half-written citation in front of him, then at the stack of evidence Dr. Washington had tried to present earlier. The same evidence he had dismissed without even glancing at it. His own words from that final paper echoed in his mind. Justice is not merely about the outcome, but about the process through which we arrive at that outcome. Officer Mills shifted uncomfortably at his podium, perhaps sensing the dramatic shift in the courtroom's dynamics. The confident authority he had displayed earlier seemed to deflate with each passing second. Judge Bennett started, then stopped. For the first time in his career, he found himself at a loss for words in his own courtroom. The weight of the moment, the realization that he had just demonstrated exactly the kind of rushed judgment he had once criticized in his law school papers, seemed to physically press down on his shoulders. Dr. Washington waited patiently, her expression neither triumphant nor accusatory. She had taught too long, seen too much, to take pleasure in moments like these. Instead, her face showed the same encouraging look she had given countless students when they were on the verge of understanding an important legal principle. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. The regular crowd of traffic violators, usually bored and restless, sat captivated by the unfolding drama. Nobody dared move or whisper. Finally, Judge Bennett cleared his throat. The sound echoed in the silent courtroom like a gunshot. He looked at his former professor, the woman who had helped shape his understanding of justice, who had written him a glowing recommendation for his first judicial appointment, who had taught him the very principles he had just failed to uphold, and made a decision that would change not just this case, but his entire approach to the bench. This court, he began, his voice finding its strength again, will take a 15-minute recess. He reached for his gavel, paused, then added, and when we return, Dr. Washington, I would very much like to hear your evidence in full. During the recess, Judge Bennett sat alone in his chambers, his hands pressed against his temples. The memories of his law school days at Emory flooded back with startling clarity. The massive wooden door couldn't block out the excited whispers from the hallway, where news of the dramatic revelation was already spreading through the courthouse. He could see Dr. Washington's classroom as clearly as if it were yesterday, room 308, where the afternoon sun would stream through tall windows, illuminating the dust particles dancing in the air. Her voice, firm but encouraging, would fill the room. The law is living, breathing. It's not just words on paper, Mr. Bennett. It's about human dignity. His eyes fell on the framed photo on his desk, his graduation day. There she was, standing proudly beside him, her hand on his shoulder. He had been one of her favorite students, she'd said, because he always questioned, always looked deeper. Never let efficiency override justice, she had written in his yearbook. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Sarah, His clerk poked her head in. "Your Honor, I pulled up your law review article from 2009, the one you wrote for Professor Washington's class." She placed the printed pages on his desk, then quietly withdrew. Bennett's hands shook slightly as he picked up the paper. The title jumped out at him: Implicit Bias in Traffic Court, a study of procedural justice in minor violations. His own words condemned him. The rushed nature of traffic court proceedings often leads to unconscious biases affecting judicial decision-making. Down the hall, in the ladies' room, Dr. Washington stood before the mirror, adjusting her collar. She wasn't thinking about the ticket anymore. Her mind wandered to a young Michael Bennett, always sitting in the front row, his hand raised with thoughtful questions. She remembered his passion for fair procedure, his earnest belief in justice for all. The young law student intern had managed to find her in the hallway. "Dr. Washington," he whispered excitedly, "we just covered your case study on implicit bias last week. This is incredible." She gave him a gentle smile, knowing this would indeed become another case study, but not for the reasons anyone might have expected. Officer Mills sat alone on a bench outside the courtroom, reviewing his notes with growing unease. 3 other officers passed by, giving him questioning looks. Word had spread fast about the professor who turned out to be the judge's former teacher. Back in his chambers, Bennett pulled out his own law school notebooks, kept all these years in his bottom drawer. There it was, Dr. Washington's final lecture on judicial responsibility. Your deadliest enemy on the bench won't be corruption or incompetence. It will be complacency. It will be the assumption that you're too good, too fair to be biased. He found his own margin notes. Justice must be both efficient and thorough. Never sacrifice one for the other. When had he forgotten that? When had his pride in processing cases quickly overcome his commitment to hearing every voice? The courthouse clock ticked steadily toward the end of recess. In the hallway, regular citizens waited, their own minor violations temporarily forgotten in the wake of the unfolding drama. Many were calling friends and family, describing the scene they had witnessed. Sarah returned with coffee, placing it carefully on his desk. 3 minutes, Your Honor." She hesitated, then added, "The press is here." Someone tipped them off. Bennett nodded, barely hearing her. He was lost in another memory. Dr. Washington's words during his judicial inauguration ceremony. "Remember, Michael, every case is someone's most important day in court. Even if it's your 1,000th speeding ticket, it's their first time facing justice." He stood up, straightening his robe. The weight of it felt different now, heavier with responsibility. Through his window, you could see Dr. Washington re-entering the courthouse, her dignified bearing unchanged. She had taught him well, but somewhere along the way, he had let the daily grind dull his principles. The bailiff's voice echoed through the hallway. 2 minutes until court resumes. Bennett gathered his thoughts and his courage. He had a choice to make, not just about a speeding ticket, but about the kind of judge he wanted to be. The kind of judge Dr. Washington had trained him to be. As he reached for his chamber door, his eyes fell one last time on his law school article's conclusion. True justice requires courage. The courage to slow down, to listen, to question our own assumptions. The time had come to put those words into action. When Judge Bennett returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had completely changed. The usual drowsy Monday morning air had been replaced with electric anticipation. Every seat was filled, with additional observers standing along the back wall. Word had spread quickly through the courthouse about the unexpected reunion of judge and professor. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice carrying more weight than usual. As Bennett took his seat, he noticed several senior judges had slipped into the back of the courtroom, curious to witness what would happen next. "Please be seated," Bennett said, his voice steadier than he felt. He looked directly at Dr. Washington, who stood calmly at the podium. "Dr. Washington, before we proceed, I owe this court, and you particularly, an apology." A murmur rippled through the gallery. In 8 years on the bench, no one had ever heard Judge Bennett apologize. Officer Mills shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his citation book forgotten in his lap. "This court," Bennett continued, his words careful and measured, "prides itself on fairness and due process. However, today I failed to live up to those standards. I allowed the pressure of a busy docket to override the fundamental right of a defendant to present their full case." Dr. Washington's expression remained neutral, but those who knew her well might have noticed the slight softening around her eyes. She had seen countless students reach moments of profound understanding over her 30 years of teaching. "Your Honor," she responded, her voice carrying the same gentle authority it had in the classroom years ago, "perhaps we could review the evidence I attempted to present earlier." Bennett nodded, gesturing to Sarah to approach the bench. "Yes, Professor. Please present your full case. This court is prepared to give it the attention it deserves." He remembered how she used to say that justice wasn't a race to be won, but a path to be walked carefully. For the next 45 minutes, Dr. Washington methodically presented her evidence. She showed photographs of the speed trap location, demonstrated how the sun's position at that time of day could affect radar readings, and presented statistical data showing troubling patterns in traffic stops at that location. The young law student intern in the back furiously took notes as his former professor turned a simple traffic hearing into a master class on constitutional law and civil rights. Several attorneys in the gallery had pulled out their phones, recording her presentation for future reference. Officer Mills' confidence seemed to shrink with each piece of evidence. When Dr. Washington presented the maintenance records for her car showing the cruise control had been recently calibrated, he began studying his shoes intently. Bennett listened with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was finally engaging with the full complexity of the case. It was as if the eager law student he had once been had emerged from beneath the efficient, but sometimes dismissive judge he had become. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Dr. Washington concluded, "I believe this case represents a broader issue with procedural justice in our traffic courts. When we rush through these so-called minor cases, we risk missing major injustices." The irony of her words wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Bennett thought back to his own law review article, sitting now on his bench, its pages marked with renewed relevance. "Thank you, Dr. Washington," Bennett said when she finished. He removed his reading glasses and looked around the packed courtroom. "This court is going to take an unusual step. I will not only review this case in detail, I will also be ordering a broader review of traffic stop patterns in the jurisdiction." Sarah, who had been his clerk for 5 years, had never seen him like this. It was as if watching a transformation in real time. The efficient but sometimes mechanical judge was being replaced by something more thoughtful, more thorough. "Court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for my ruling," Bennett announced. "And Dr. Washington," she looked up at her former student, now looking more like the thoughtful young man she had taught than the hurried judge of an hour ago, "thank you for reminding this court of its fundamental obligations." As the bailiff called out, "All rise," once more, the atmosphere in courtroom 302 was thick with significance. Everyone present knew they had witnessed something rare and important, not just the possibility of justice being served, but justice being transformed. Dr. Washington gathered her materials quietly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Some lessons, she knew, took years to fully sink in. But when they did, they had the power to change not just one case, but an entire system. The next morning, courtroom 302 was packed beyond capacity. Judge Bennett had spent the entire night reviewing evidence, statistics, and his own past rulings. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his sleepless night, but his voice was clear and strong as he began to deliver his ruling. "The court has thoroughly reviewed the evidence presented in the case of Dr. Regina Washington," he began, looking across the unusually crowded room. Local media had gathered in the back, their presence adding to the day's gravity. "What began as a simple traffic violation has revealed issues that demand this court's full attention." Sarah noticed how different her boss looked today. Gone was the rushed efficiency that had marked his previous hearings. Instead, he sat with the thoughtful demeanor of a man who had rediscovered his purpose. "First, regarding the specific citation," Bennett continued, shuffling through his carefully prepared notes, "this court finds significant problems with the evidence presented by the citing officer." Officer Mills, sitting in the front row, seemed to shrink in his chair. Dr. Washington's evidence regarding the speed trap location, supported by statistical data and technical analysis, raises serious concerns. The court has verified that the sun's position at the time of the citation could indeed have affected radar readings, as the defense suggested. The judge then lifted a thick folder. "More troublingly, this court has reviewed traffic stop data from the past 6 months at this location." He paused, his expression grave. "The patterns revealed in this data are deeply concerning." Dr. Washington sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, watching her former student demonstrate the thorough analysis she had always encouraged in her classroom. "The citation against Dr. Washington is hereby dismissed," Bennett announced. But instead of moving to the next case, he continued. "However, this court cannot ignore the broader issues this case has brought to light." He pulled out a second document. "I am ordering an immediate review of all traffic citations issued at this location over the past year. Furthermore, I am recommending an independent investigation into potential racial disparities in traffic enforcement patterns within our jurisdiction." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Several civil rights attorneys in the gallery began taking rapid notes. Officer Mills stood abruptly and left the courtroom, his face flushed. Additionally, Bennett's voice cut through the murmurs. "This court is implementing new procedures for traffic violation hearings." He looked directly at Dr. Washington. "Every defendant will be given adequate time to present their full case. Efficiency is important, but not at the expense of justice." The young law student intern who had witnessed the previous day's events was now sitting with several classmates who had skipped morning classes to attend. They watched their professor's calm expression, understanding now why she had always insisted that real change happened in small courtrooms as often as in Supreme Courts. Finally, Bennett said, "This court is establishing a review committee to examine our procedures for potential bias. We will be requesting assistance from legal scholars and civil rights experts." He paused, allowing himself a small smile, "and we hope that Dr. Washington might consider lending her expertise to this endeavor." Sarah noticed tears in the eyes of an elderly black woman sitting in the gallery. Later, she would learn that the woman had lost her job last year after missing work to contest a ticket at this same location, a ticket that had been rushed through without a proper hearing. "This case has reminded us," Bennett concluded, his voice carrying the weight of personal revelation, "that justice is not a convenience. It is a right. And it must be protected with vigilance, regardless of how minor the case may seem." As he finished speaking, the courtroom remained silent for a moment before erupting into quiet conversations. Reporters rushed out to file their stories, while legal observers discussed the broader implications of the ruling. Dr. Washington finally allowed herself a full smile. She gathered her belongings slowly, watching as various attorneys and activists approached the bench to request copies of the ruling. This was why she had chosen to contest a simple traffic ticket, not just to defend herself, but to expose systemic issues that affected countless others. As she prepared to leave, she noticed Judge Bennett watching her from the bench. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, teacher and student shared an understanding. Sometimes, the most important lessons took years to fully manifest, but when they did, they had the power to create ripples of change that went far beyond a single courtroom. The impact of that morning's ruling would soon extend far beyond courtroom 302, but for now, justice had been served, not just for one professor, but for an entire community that had long awaited such recognition. 6 months after the landmark traffic court ruling, Judge Michael Bennett stood at the podium in Emory Law School's main auditorium. The room was filled with judges, lawyers, law enforcement officers, and students, all gathered for the first session of the newly established Judicial Bias Training Program. "When I dismissed a simple traffic ticket 6 months ago," Bennett began, his voice carrying across the silent room, "I didn't realize it would lead to the most significant changes in our court's history." He paused, looking at the familiar face in the front row, Dr. Washington, who sat with the same dignified presence she had maintained throughout her career. The statistics displayed on the screen behind him told a compelling story. Since implementing the new procedures, successful traffic ticket appeals had increased by 40%. More importantly, the racial disparity in traffic stop outcomes had decreased significantly. The infamous speed trap location had been thoroughly investigated, leading to the retirement of 2 officers and the implementation of new monitoring systems. "Today marks the beginning of something important," Bennett continued. "Not just a training program, but a commitment to recognize and address our own biases." He gestured toward Dr. Washington. "And there's no one better qualified to lead us in this journey than my former professor, who taught me this lesson in the most unexpected way." Dr. Washington took the podium to enthusiastic applause. The past months had been busy. She had helped design the training program while continuing her teaching duties and serving on the court's new review committee. Her traffic court experience had become a case study, now taught in law schools across the country. "Justice," she began, her voice clear and strong, is not about being perfect. It's about being willing to recognize our imperfections and address them. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of young officers and veteran judges alike. What happened in courtroom 302 that day wasn't just about a traffic ticket. It was about the courage to change. The program they unveiled that day was comprehensive. It included regular review of court decisions for potential bias, mandatory waiting periods before rulings in certain cases, and a new system for defendants to submit complete evidence packages before their hearings. In the audience, Officer Mills, now required to attend as part of his continued employment, sat quietly, taking notes. The experience had changed him too, making him more thoughtful in his traffic stops and more careful with his documentation. Sarah Martinez, who had been promoted to Chief Court Administrator, shared the practical results of their changes. Average case processing time had increased by 12 minutes, but appeal rates had dropped dramatically. More importantly, community trust in the court system had shown measurable improvement. The young law student who had witnessed the original case, now a newly minted intern at the Public Defender's Office, raised his hand during the Q&A session. "How do we maintain this momentum?" he asked. "How do we ensure these changes last?" Dr. Washington smiled at the question. "By remembering that every case matters," she answered. "By understanding that justice isn't just about the law, it's about the people the law serves." Judge Bennett nodded in agreement. He thought about how different his courtroom felt now. The rushed atmosphere had been replaced by something more deliberate, more thorough. Yes, they handled fewer cases per day, but they handled them right. As the session concluded, Bennett and Dr. Washington stood together for photographs. Local newspapers had dubbed their story "The Lesson That Changed the Court," and it had inspired similar reviews in jurisdictions across the country. "You know," Bennett said quietly to his former professor as the cameras flashed, "that traffic ticket was the most expensive lesson I've ever learned, and the most valuable." Dr. Washington laughed softly. "The best lessons often come when we least expect them, Michael." She patted his arm, and sometimes the student becomes the teacher. The afternoon sun streamed through the auditorium windows, reminiscent of those long-ago days in her classroom. But now, instead of just teaching theory, they were putting principles into practice, creating real change in real courtrooms. As the attendees filed out, many stopped to share their own stories of bias they had witnessed or unconsciously perpetrated. Each story reinforced the importance of their work, the need for continuous vigilance and improvement. The traffic ticket that had brought them to this point was now framed in Bennett's chambers, a reminder that justice could be found in the smallest of cases, and that change could begin with a single moment of recognition. Outside, the Atlanta traffic flowed as usual, but inside the courthouse, something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't just about traffic tickets anymore. It was about building a justice system that truly lived up to its name, one case at a time.